Hi, everyone. Welcome to Board Game Broadcast, or Board Game Broadcast. I'm not sure if I have the name right. But anyways, tonight I am going to be talking about the most exciting topic ever. I'm going to talk about contracts. It's going to be fun. Okay, maybe not that much fun, but I'm excited, and I put a presentation together for you. It's only 500 slides. No, seriously, it's not 500 slides. For those who don't know me, I am Debbie Moynihan. I am the COO of White Wizard Games, and I have worked on quite a few designer contracts. And just as background for me, before I came into the board game industry, I was in management in multiple publicly traded companies. So IBM, Progress Software. I worked at Iona, which got bought by Progress Software. And I worked on pretty big contracts. I managed the product management team for a billion-dollar business at IBM, and we did a lot of OEM technology agreements and partnerships. And I also worked on quite a few acquisitions at IBM, which are a big deal. So while I might not have seen every single game design contract out there, if you want someone to take a look at your contracts, I have a good eye to look at a contract and see if something looks off, if maybe you're not protected or something weird is in there. I've read a lot of contracts, and I've worked with a lot of different top attorneys on contracts. So, when I was working on really big deals at companies like IBM, I wasn't the one sort of deciding the terms that were going into the contract. There was a lot of legal people involved. And that's where I'm going to let you know I am not an attorney. My husband told me, make sure you tell them you're not a lawyer. So this is not professional legal advice. This is my personal perspective. I, work at White Wizard Games, which is a publisher of board games. So it's my personal perspective, my personal experience, both from game designer contracts and working on other contracts. Thanks. I do like pink. So I like pink a lot. So I don't have any pink in my presentation though. So I'm going to head into my presentation and let's see if I can figure this out. I'm using two monitors today, which is a new thing. Which is a new thing for me. So let's see if I can make this work. Bear with me. All right, there we go. So you might want to expand your view on your screen if you want to see the details of the presentation. I had to do that when I did my test run, so if you want to see the details. So this first slide is kind of a joke, but it's about reading the fine print. One of the things that intimidates people about contracts is they don't always understand the language, and oftentimes people will say, well, this is an established company, probably if other people have signed this contract, it must be pretty good. So I don't know what half of this stuff means, but I'm going to go ahead and sign it. So because of that, I am going to cover some terminology in this presentation. And, if you already know it, I'm saving that part for the end. So if you already know contract terminology and you just came to say hi to me, that's cool. And you don't have to say it to the very end. But for people who maybe haven't had the opportunity to have a lot of experience with contracts, I do want to cover the basic terms for them, but I saved that for the second half of the presentation. So if you want to know things like indemnification and stuff like that, we're going to cover that in the second part of the presentation. But I'll touch on some of that at the beginning, but beginning is going to be more of an overview. So in this contract, Dilbert says, well, this is a lot of details in this. I can't really understand it, but, it will cost me a lot of money to get an attorney, so I'm just going to go ahead and sign it. And the big joke is, that there's a whole series of comics that come after this one where, the company's harvesting his organs. So it's funny, but not funny. So I'm going to cover high-level goals. So when you're looking at a contract and you're thinking about what do I want to get out of this contract, how to think about that, resources for one of my big points is you need to do due diligence. So how do you do the due diligence? Where do you get that information from? And then I'm going to cover, like I said, some of the legal terminology. So hopefully people that couldn't come live can watch that later when they're actually looking at a contract in hand. And Q&A, I will do at the end, but you guys can ask questions at any point. I have the comments open here, so I will answer questions as I can as I go along. So what is a good contract? To me, at a high level, a good contract is one where both parties feel like it's fair. Like, hey, I got a good deal, and the other person feels like they got a good deal, so that's a good contract, right? Not quite. Like a really good contract, a contract that actually is good, is one that actually is fair. So the key here is that sometimes one party knows a lot more than the other party. So they, even though the other party thinks they got a good deal, they could have actually got a better deal if they knew how to negotiate, if they knew what to ask for. The party doing the contract would have given them a better deal, but they didn't know, and they felt like what they were offered was a fair deal. So, my goal here is to teach people enough so you think enough to ask for things, or get advice from other people so that you can get the most fair deal that you can. So how do you go about protecting yourself? One is a lot of research. So and I'm not just talking about reading like blog posts that are 5+ years old. I'm talking about talking to as many people as you can, getting the details of as many contracts as you can, things like that. And also, I personally think it's really important to have a mentor who knows about contracts and who has experience with contracts. And it could be a lawyer. So if you don't have a mentor and you're not good at networking, you can hire a lawyer. I could make some recommendations on lawyers. They're very, very expensive. So, and their goal is generally to make sure the contract is legally looks okay, but the best person to give you like the advice that I'm talking about here is a business person who has actually signed these types of contracts, either from the publisher side or from the designer side. So, I highly recommend that you seek a mentor and have them review your contract. I also, would be happy to look at your contract. Like I mentioned, I worked on a lot of high level deals. So I'd be happy to sign a non-disclosure if someone wants me to do that, to sign their contract. I can even give you a non-disclosure that you can have me sign, a mutual non-disclosure. So if you want to share that with me, it means I will review your contract, but I won't tell anyone else what was in that contract. It will be just between you and I. I'll look at it. I'll give you advice. We can both go on our way. But, if you do have someone review your contract, you want to make sure it's someone that you trust, because, most people don't want people telling everyone what's in their contracts. So yeah. So looking beyond the contract. So most of the posts in the game designer groups are about what is the right percentage. What percentage should I be getting? Should it be of revenue? Should it be wholesale value? That seems to be like the big thing people care about. I think people are focused on the wrong thing. First of all, like, let's face it, like if you know any game designers, like, or publishers for that matter, like we're not all driving Ferraris and stuff. So even those with really popular games and hot games, like, yes, we can make a living, but whether you're off by a percentage this way or that way isn't going to, be the difference between being a billionaire or not. So I personally believe the most important thing is finding the right partner, finding who's going to be a good partner for you where you're at right now. And, are you both going to be happy with each other where you're at right now? And can you agree to a fair deal where you are right now? So it depends on where you're at. Are you, a popular designer? You're signing, your 5th, your 10th game. Is this your first game? You've never been published. That's going to impact what you can negotiate and what might be fair for you. Like if it's an established person who's published many games, they can be like, hey, I need you to have this minimum marketing budget for me if you're going to sign my game. But if you're looking to be published for the first time, you don't have as much to offer. So maybe your game is awesome, but you don't, bring an audience with you. So, keep that in mind when you're thinking about who's the right partner for you. Sometimes for people, going with a smaller company might be a little bit better, for your first game, so you can get, that much more attention on your game. So looking at things like, what is this publisher's portfolio strategy? It's sort of like when you're like looking at houses, you don't want to buy like the most expensive house in the neighborhood. You want to offer a game that's a good fit within their portfolio. You don't want to be like some outlier weird game and they're not sure if it's going to be successful. Ideally, you want to find a publisher that you're pretty confident your kind of game will be successful with that publisher. So do they make your type of game is a big thing, and how do they see it fitting into their portfolio? Crowdfunding, if crowdfunding is important to you and you want to crowdfund. All right, thanks. Someone's taken off. I can't see who's who on here, but thanks for coming and stopping by. What's our distribution like? So distribution is huge. are they in the US only? Are they US and international? So, some publishers distribute just in the US and they might be with a couple of distributors. Other publishers are bigger and every major distributor carries them, and they already have international partners that, will translate into, French, German, and the other, major languages and areas where board games are really popular. So, if you can get a publisher like that, that's more attractive, but you kind of have to ask and research to figure out, what each publisher's opportunities are. If you have a really hot game, then you might be picking between multiple publishers. So this is important, whether they are in mass market. So, we saw a game we really liked, but it was a mass market game. We're not like huge in mass market as a publisher. So, the game went with another publisher, and, I think it was definitely the right choice for them. Even though like we are, on the way and getting more and more into, we're in Barnes and Nobles right now. But again, if you have multiple options, looking for someone who's already where you want to be and successful with, your type of game. And then production, I also have production quality in here. So, depending on the publisher and what you're looking for, like if you're looking for like very high end, miniatures and fancy components, then, there's companies who are really into that. But, you're not going to go to someone who, just makes very simple games if that's, what you're looking for. Okay, let's see if I can figure out. And then one thing, so some designers ask a lot about this and others don't, but I personally, coming back to like having a partnership, think this is like very important. What are they going to do to invest in your game? I love when designers ask these kind of questions. It shows that they care about what's going to happen with their game, where it's going to go. Do you have a marketing budget? So I usually talk about these things proactively. So when we're excited about a game, I'll be like, oh yeah, we're going to I put together like a whole list of bullet points. Like we'll do a Kickstarter, we'll go into distribution, we'll do this, we'll do that. We'll do Facebook advertising as part of the crowdfunding campaign. I get really excited. I have sort of a whole plan that I can talk about with them of the things that, we generally do. And then I could also come up with special things if depending on the type of game it is. But I've talked to some designers who were like, wow, like this other company didn't tell me anything like this. They didn't tell me anything about like how they were going to market my game. So, it's not saying the other company isn't going to market the game, but it's kind of a good thing to know. Because again, like if you're just focused on the percentage and a company gives you a high percentage or what you feel like is a high percentage, but then they're not like spending any money on marketing and they're not going to the major conventions, that could be a bad thing, that, you might be getting a higher percentage of not as much money. So, what's the timeline? So right now, people are really backed up. So a lot of publishers are looking, multiple years out if you want to get on their roadmap. So, if you want to get your game published sooner, that's, again, like a big thing. Like, are you happy to get the percentage you want, but your game's like 3 years out on someone's schedule? And, a lot of things can happen between now and then. That's kind of important. And then, what happens if your game does not sell well? So this is another thing that you can negotiate into your contract. One of the things when I talk about sort of negotiation and think about negotiation is what are your must-haves and what are you willing to give in? And if you can't get what you really want, making trade-offs for that. Pam's asking a question here about worried about scaring off the publisher by asking too many questions. So, this happens a lot with job interviews too. So when people are interviewing for a job and they are all about like, I'm so great and I'm this and I'm that and giving like the answers they think the person wants to hear. And then they get the job and they realize, oh, like they don't have this, or I don't have this opportunity, or it's not what I thought, because they were afraid to ask questions ahead of time. But once you sign the contract, that's your partner, whether, you're happy with them or not. So I think it's good to be cautious. Like you don't want to like ask a million questions every single time you talk to them. But I think this is on my next slide here. I have this part, which is, and then I'll get into a little bit of what you're talking about, Pam. Don't believe everything you read. So, I talk about going to resources and reading things, but like, don't assume what's in every single blog post or every single podcast you listen to pertains to you, or that it pertains to a publisher. Like, for example, people will tell you, and I have a couple examples here, from James Math. A lot of people recommend. James was awesome. He's, no longer with us, but nobody that's been around will ever forget him. He's been an amazing resource. And this particular blog post that I'm referencing has tons of awesome stuff. It's the title something like, your alien getting your first contract. But there's a couple of things he said in here that, I don't agree with as a publisher. One is, hey, if you already kickstarted, and this is older, so again, he wrote this back in 2014, so no surprise that it might not be as up to date now. He said, hey, if you've already kickstarted, it's going to be like almost impossible to find a publisher. Well, we've signed a game that already kickstarted, KAPOW, and I actually noticed it on Kickstarter, and I was excited about it, and that's where my interest started with the game. So I don't agree with that. So I'm not saying like it. I understand why some publishers would feel that way. So, but my point here is that like, just because some publishers feel that way doesn't mean the one you're talking to feels that way. Like I was talking to someone at a I call them speed dating, the speed pitching events at a convention. And when we walked up to the table, they said, oh yeah, you wouldn't want a game like this. I'm like, what? Like, why? Well, first of all, a lot of people feel that way because at those events you have to go to every table. So, I might not be interested in their game, but, you're already going to be spending time with that person. So first of all, I would assume the best. And even if they aren't interested, they might have a friend who might be interested. So being as positive as possible is like a definite plus. Like if you're spending your time sitting at a table pitching your game, you should be super excited about it and don't, jump to conclusions about what any particular publisher wants. Yeah, someone else commented here that they've had friends get their game signed after it was crowdsourced. And then the other one is no one's going to buy your game or pay you a lump sum. So we've actually multiple times when we've made offers for a contract, before we write up the contract, we've offered multiple times to game designers an option to either we'll buy your game for X amount of dollars and we just own it and we take it and we own it and we'll give you this amount. No matter what we sell it for, you're going to get this amount, or we will do a royalty percentage. So we have definitely offered multiple times to, buy someone's game. For us, it just like keeps it very simple. So, and we're pretty confident in our business model. If we see a game that we really like, that we think is a good fit in our portfolio, we feel confident that we can estimate, what we think we can get from that game in revenue. So we've done that. I know maybe most people don't do it. I don't know. Maybe no one else has done it. Maybe it's crazy, but we've done it. So I know that it's not impossible. So it can happen. So again, just saying, don't believe everything you've read. And if this, like, if say you needed money, say like you have something that's come up and you need money, like you could go to a publisher that you're talking with and say, hey, would you consider this amount for my game? And you can take it and, even though everyone says don't ever sign a game in perpetuity, you can take it and own in perpetuity. Why? Because me personally, my goal is I need to pay off this loan or something. So, if you have something that you need, one of the big things in negotiation is, we're heading into negotiation now, is what do you need? What do you want? So, what's your end goal? So for example, if your goal is, hey, you have some debt and you really want to pay it off, like credit card debt, maybe your goal is to try to get a lump sum to pay it off, or maybe your dream is to start your own publishing company. You need a little bit of money so you can start it. So in that case, maybe you would consider, signing a deal where you're selling your game for a lump sum of money. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. And in most cases, people will choose a royalty agreement because, they feel like, oh, well, if, you're willing to pay me this amount, then you must be pretty sure you're going to make at least this amount. So they want to go for the upside and make even more money. So I think a lot of people in the case would prefer a royalty agreement. But like I said, it depends on your personal situation. How much money could you expect to get to sell the rights of your game? I mean, that really depends on the game. So it really depends on how much. So I guess one way I could look at it is, how much would I expect to make from your game? So as a publisher, so if I look at it from a publisher perspective, I could look at a game and say, okay, I estimate, so when we run a Kickstarter, we'll estimate, okay, we think we're going to make X amount of money on the Kickstarter. And we'll actually say, this is what we think like the low end is, this is what we think the high end is going to be. So, I could estimate based on Kickstarters I've run and Kickstarters for games like yours that have been run, how much money I think I could raise. And then, so I would take that as one piece. And then I'd also think, okay, when the game goes into distribution, how much do I think I can make with that? If I'm buying the game outright, like, it's a big risk because I don't know, like, is the market going to tank? Is there going to be a pandemic? Like, I don't know what's going to happen. So I would be paying you up front. So I wouldn't necessarily pay you a premium. I wouldn't necessarily pay you like 100% of what I think I could make if I was paying you upfront for it, because in this case, you take zero risk. I'm taking all the risk, so I'm paying you upfront. So I would say I can't give you a number because I don't know anything about your game, and I don't know who you'd be pitching it to, but because definitely some people have more money than others, and some people have business models where, one publisher will kickstart a game and, maybe they could raise 50,000 and a different publisher could publish the same game or launch the same game on Kickstarter and they could make, 500,000 or a million. So I can't say off the top of my head how much any one game could make, because I'd have to know the game and know the publisher. But as a business analyst or someone who used to be a business analyst, I could estimate, what I think a specific publisher could make from a specific game. I think most companies would rather do a royalty agreement because, like I said, it minimizes their risk. They pay when they get the money. Even with Kickstarter. So with Kickstarter, usually you would recognize the revenue when the product ships. So, the way that you would pay out your royalties typically would be when you recognize the revenue from an accounting perspective. So most people would rather do a royalty, but I think, if someone wants to talk to me one-on-one about their games, if you're in that situation where you'd rather sell off an entire game, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one, but I can't just throw out a number of, and I don't want to share details of specific, things that we've offered to people. Who you're dealing with. So thinking about what the publisher's looking for. So for example, for us, White Wizard Games, we look for ideally evergreen products that we think we can launch and put out into market, and then over time, continue to put out expansions for it and to continue to build on that brand. We put a lot of effort and initiative and marketing budget into every single one of our products, but we have a lot fewer products than some other companies who, comparable to our revenue size, we have a smaller number of products than many other companies. So for us, we're looking for specific things. Some people are looking for something to be super hot and trendy, so like movies, every season that seems to be, super hot and trendy. Theme for games, I feel like in the last year it's been flowers and stuff has been a big thing, but cats seem to have been hot forever now. But so some companies seem to focus on sort of the trendy hot things. Everyone has something specific that they're looking for, so you have to figure out are you a really good fit for what this company is looking for? What are your must-haves is really important. So it's most important because you do not want to say this is a must-have if it's not a must-have. This is the most important thing I'm going to tell you from a negotiation perspective. So when you talk about, I'm nervous, I don't want to ask too many questions. It's okay to ask questions, but what you have to be very careful is if you say, I have to have this. I can't do a deal unless I get 10% of revenue. I can't do a deal unless, I have control over how the game is going to be designed down the line. Once you start saying, I can't do a deal unless, or this has to happen, automatically the person doing the negotiation, they're taking a mental note of that, whether they know it or not. And that's when they might walk away. So we've had situations where we've, walked away because it didn't match our business model. I'll give you an example. Because I'm kind of sharing some of my personal experience just to give examples. But an example is a lot of people will give examples of, like I mentioned earlier, that you should never sign your game in perpetuity, or, you want to have an exit clause when if they're not selling enough of your sales. And we had a situation where we were very interested in the game and the designer was interested in signing with us, but one of the things that was a must-have for them was we needed to keep the sales above a certain level, and even 5 years out after we published it, multiple years out after we published it, needed, and I can't remember what the number was, I want to say 25,000 units a year, but what we considered a very high number. If we went below that, then they wanted the rights back to the game. And that's totally reasonable. You can ask for whatever you want. If that's what you want, that's totally cool. But for us, that doesn't work with our model, because we're going to put our full like hearts and souls into building up the game, building the brand and growing it. And like, so, and we feel like, say we did an awesome job and the game did awesome, but like after a few years, it's not selling as high number of units. We didn't think that would be fair to then like give the game up and have it go to someone else when we've built so much of the brand up with our, audience and our marketing budget and things like that. So that's a very specific example, but I just want to give you like an example of what I mean when I say, oh, if you say you must have something. I've also had multiple publishers tell me stories of when they had a game that they liked, but they kind of would have liked to put it in a different direction. So the art was amazing, but they would have liked to change it in some ways. Maybe they wanted to retheme it. I've heard that as well. And the person was like, no way, like this has to be like a robot theme or whatever. I'm making the robot theme up. But, where the publisher saw a lot of potential where they could fit it with their portfolio, but they would have wanted to change something that was near and dear to the designer. So I'm totally supportive of a designer saying, nope, this is like my robot game. It's staying a robot game. They're totally their prerogative. But if your goal is, hey, I want to get my first game published, then I would tell you to minimize it has to be this way, because publishers have a lot of experience and maybe they want to take it in a different direction, maybe a slightly different direction, maybe a huge different direction. But I would at least be open-minded and say, well, I hadn't really thought of that. Can we explore it more and just get more information? But don't, knee-jerk and say, no, I would never want to change the theme of my game. And unless you really don't want to change the theme of your game. Again, if your goal is it must be this theme, it has to be exactly the way I want it, that's cool. That's what I'm talking about. That's what you want. Those are your must-haves. But if you are like, I really want to get my first game signed with a publisher that can help get my name out there, then, that's a different approach. So think about what's important to you and don't, and be open-minded, I guess is what I'm saying. Don't narrow yourself down too soon, especially if it's your first agreement. What was your biggest turnoff from a designer? A designer's must-have, someone asked. I guess I'm trying to think of some. That was a big one. Even though I know it's important to some people, the getting the rights back after a certain amount of time, because like we want a brand to be like part of who we are. So like Star Realms, Hero Realms, Sorcerer, even though, we acquired that and it wasn't designed. Now Peter actually works for us to design our Sorcerer, but initially when we brought it on, like we put our heart and soul into it. And, we want to do that with every game that we sign. So like for us having the rights to the game, assuming like we do a good job launching it and bringing in business and stuff, like I would be totally fine with a minimum, like, hey, you have to sell a minimum amount, like in the first few years or something. Like I think that's totally reasonable. But like if you don't like sell superstar volumes forever, then I get the game back. I didn't like that personally. The other biggest turnoff I had from a designer is when you negotiate an agreement and then you write up the contract and then they come back and they're like, oh, I also need this and this and this. And that's not how contract negotiation like should work. Like, okay, it's one thing if someone just doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm just going to put these points up here to make sure I cover all these. If someone doesn't realize and they get more information, they want something in, but it's another thing if it's a super experienced person who's done multiple contracts, you've come to a verbal agreement, and then when you write the agreement and you're like getting close to signing, then they want all kinds of stuff added. That's a negotiation tactic that I think is a poor negotiation tactic. Like I said, you kind of want to come into a room, might be a virtual room because, we're not really getting together with people, but come into a room and like agree on what you want, like at a high level on this is what's important to me, this is what's important to me. But if you then come back and say, oh, I need all these other 10 things in addition to all those accommodations you've already made for me, and then you're not willing to give anything, it's a little much. So I would say figuring out what it is that's important to you up front and getting as familiar as you can with as many contracts as you can so that you know what to ask for. Like out of the gate. So basically, once you talk and you discuss, like, it's not uncommon, at least for us and many other places where I've worked, that you kind of go back and forth, with a couple of email exchanges on, hey, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're thinking. What do you think we do for marketing? This is what we do for marketing. We had a contract that we sort of split up some of the work. We bumped up the percentage, but we also were like, okay, you're going to do this and this and this, as part of the launch of the game. And then once you kind of come to that agreement, then you write the contract up. But then once you come to that agreement, you write by the time you're writing the contract up, if then you're like, oh, I have these 20 other things that I wanted, that's, where it can get a little uncomfortable. So, trying to get the big things that you want. I'm talking about big things, but the big things that you want on the table up front. And the other thing is, trying to figure out what the person that you're negotiating with, what's important to them. So I've actually taken like negotiation training, and a big part of it is like when you're negotiating, like you don't know where the other person's coming from. So, for example, like they might have had a project that they have an issue with and it can't launch, and they have an opening in their schedule, and your game would just be perfect for that. But they're not really going to come right out and tell you that. But if you talk to a lot of people on the team, you ask them a lot of questions, it could come out in conversation. This isn't a specific example, I'm just making this up, but, if they sometimes people will really want your game, but they're not going to tell you that because they don't want to seem too eager. Like, it's strong negotiation to not seem super eager, even if you're really, really interested in something. So, and I think that's totally ethical. What are one or two things you think should be must-haves for all designers in every contract? Well, I'm going to walk through the parts of a contract, so I guess I can talk about those there. But I think I personally, after having worked on some contracts, because when I first started working on contracts in this industry, I didn't have experience, and I didn't know a lot of people. I couldn't like get my hands on a lot of contracts. But now that I've seen more and heard more, I think something that isn't always in there, but I think is important to be in there would be like the timeline. Like I talked about the timeline for when your product's going to be released. And then also there's this, I don't know if you'll be able to see it if I hold it up, but this is really from a designer perspective. You probably can't even see this. Hold on. I'll take this off so you can see this a little bit more. Licensing your game. This is a checklist from Maple Syrup, and I really like it. It's really great. It's maybe not as great if you're a publisher, because it's like, don't do this, don't ever do that. It's all from the designer's perspective, but I put this presentation together to talk to designers, so I think this is a great checklist. I'm not sure exactly where it's posted, but I have a copy of it that Hunfoon gave to me, so I can post it in the group. It has the link on here, but it was something the Maple Syrup team put together, and I think it's really cool. But a couple of things that they have in here are well, things like, do you want your name on the box? Because if that's important to you, you should actually have it in the contract. But that's something that you shouldn't have as a must-have for every publisher, because some publishers never put anyone's name on the box. So that's a good example of one of those things that, like, you might be careful about saying, I have to be on the box. If you have to, some publishers are going to be like, all right, well, I'm not doing a game with you. So I think I'm just looking at this list. Oh, I think something that's really important is like what happens if the company like goes out of business or can't publish your game for financial reasons. So if they're unable to publish your game, having an out clause for that. So if they don't publish your game by a certain amount of time, or I think having a timeline for when they will publish your game, and then if they don't publish it by that time, what do you do to get your game back, is a very reasonable thing to have. And as a designer, I think it's something I personally would want, but it's not in every contract. I mean, there's some basic ones in here, like on this, like, oh, make sure you get like free copies as a designer, like things like that, which are pretty basic. But I'm going to go through some of the sections of a contract, and we can, I don't know how I'm doing on time, 9:36. But I can post this too. Okay, let me see if I can get my presentation back up. So yeah, so on the negotiation again, like just thinking about like what's important to you, what are you willing to walk away from? And you should walk away if you can't get it. If you're starting to feel like, hey, this isn't going really well, and I feel like they're asking for more than they're giving, you know, you don't have to go with them. Like, don't feel like you have to sign a contract. That's a time when it's good to have a mentor or a friend and just talk to them and be like, what do you think? Because these things can get emotional. This is your life. This is your baby. You've been like working on this for a long time. So talk to someone, have someone else review it who's not so emotionally attached to, your baby. I think it's really good to have someone to partner with on the review and the contract stuff. Like I said, I'm happy to review people's contracts, but I'm not an attorney. So resources like where you get, I'll just click through these, but like where can you meet other people, meet other designers, so you can be like, hey, would you be willing to share examples of your contracts or things that you think are really important? I think the question Pam asked of what are the one or two things everyone must have as a designer, you should be asking these of other successful designers. So like Board Game Design Lab put out a book, I don't remember the title of it, but it's basically like he interviewed or had people fill out a question and answer of, and it's like lots of top game designers, and you could reach out to them and, ask to do, a one-on-one conversation with them if you don't know them. A lot of people are willing to do a quick call with you or, be a mentor to you if you reach out and you're friendly and you ask. Not everyone will. It's best if these kind of things, if you could find someone that knows them to introduce you. But I wouldn't be afraid to reach out to other game designers. And also, if you search on these groups, there's, examples of, so when I'm working on contracts, I look on these groups to see like, what are people saying are the terms, because like, that's what I expect the game designers who are doing research to be looking there. So as part of my due diligence, I always look on these groups and see like, okay, what's the latest chatter on terms and stuff. So I definitely recommend that, you do the same. And then, so yeah, reaching out to both publisher contacts and designer contacts. So remember when you're at speed pitching and like those people come by and they're like not, and they're not like the right publisher for you, those are great contacts to like, hey, would you mind taking a look at this contract that I'm looking at, or hey, what do you think is important in a contract? Like, so don't look at everyone as like, oh, will I sign my game with this person? Look at them as, hey, I could be helpful to them because you're at all these events. You could be like, hey, here's a designer who has a game that might be a good fit for you. And you could also be asking them for help on the things you need help for. So I would look at like each contact that you meet in the industry as, how could I help this person? How could they help me? And, start to build that relationship. And it looks like Pam found the link. That's great. Oh yeah. So there's so many awesome people in the industry, and there's lots of really fun events. So I know we can't go to conventions right now, but when I joined the industry, I didn't know anyone, a few years ago. And my husband, Rob, who had been in the industry for a long time, had sort of like his group of friends that all come. He's Magic the Gathering Hall of Famer. So he had an established group of friends. They're all like from the Magic community. So like Alan Hockman, who runs Gamer Mats, and, he's from Magic, Steve Port from Magic, who runs Legion Supplies. So he sort of had his own friend group, and he wasn't really introducing me to a lot of people that like I wanted to meet, like other publishers and game designers and other women in the industry. So I took it upon myself to just try to be outgoing. I'm actually kind of introverted. I like to be alone a lot. Like I've actually really enjoyed the shutdown, but I really made an effort to get out and meet people. Like Rachel and I also have run quite a few women's networking events. I made a point of going to BGG Con because I wanted to actually have time to play games with people, and that was super fun. I've gone a couple times to that now, so I encourage you to go to those things. And there's still like a lot of digital things like this that you can go to if you can't make it to the get into my fun part now. If you can't make it to I missed this one, so here I have a couple of fun pictures here, but there's so many fun people. Everyone's like so nice and so forthcoming. I came from high tech where nobody would share. Like if I saw someone from my competition, there's no way I would go over and talk to them. We would just like all be out at night at a convention, like just make dirty glances at one another. We would never talk to each other. We were also restricted by non-compete agreements to even talk to each other about anything business related anyways. So we're very lucky to be in an industry where everyone's like super helpful. All right, so now I'm going to get into the exciting stuff. So if you don't want to hear about legal words, you can drop off right now. I actually use an actual contract to kind of walk through and see what some of the terms were that I thought everyone should know. So when you look at a contract, you know what's happening. Sorry, I have some allergies. So at the beginning of a contract, it'll always establish who the parties are in the agreement. So, you know, typically in these contracts, the parties are going to be the publisher and the designer. And at the top, you know, it'll say who you are as a publisher and who you are as a designer. And it'll have in quotes, publisher and designer. What that means is everywhere else in the contract, it's just going to say designer. It's not going to say your name, but it's going to be referencing you. So at the top, they say who each person is. And then throughout the contract, they use these generic terms, and that's so that they don't have to, you know, rewrite the whole contract every time. Assigned property, also sometimes called licensed property, is what are we talking about? Like what's actually being licensed in this agreement? And then assignment is like, what are we doing with the property? So this could be like, okay, I'm assigning like everything, copyright, the universe, you know, that's where you list out what am I giving you out of my intellectual property. And intellectual property, also called IP, is basically like your secret sauce. Like this is your brand, what you're about. You know, it could be, you know, game mechanics and stuff, which, you know, as we know, are difficult to protect, but still, you know, being the first game to do something cool is an important thing that you would be licensing as part of licensing your game. And sometimes it's a world and universe if you've, you know, developed a world and a universe as part of your game. So for example, like, you know, for Star Realms, when we license it to our foreign localization partners, you know, will license, you know, everything about it, the art, the copyrights, the, you know, the world that it exists in, you know, all the files. So we have a whole slew of things that we're assigning to them to be able to use for their localization and their distribution of our games in other languages. And if people have specific things they want me to cover during this, I'll try to cover these basic ones pretty quickly, but just ask questions. If there's something you want me to cover, ask questions. And if I don't get to it in here, I'll cover it when I get to the end of what I prepared. Sub-licensing in the context of board games is usually localization. So if there's terms in there for sub-licensing, it usually means if me as a publisher does a deal with someone else to do stuff with your games, how do I pay you for that? And is it allowed? So, you know, I've signed contracts where I can't do that. I'm not allowed. If I want to take a game and publish it in French, I need to go back and do another contract with the designer. I've also done contracts where it's automatically in there, and I say in there what the percentage revenue is going to be. How we do it is it's a percentage of what we get from our partner. So, you know, we partner with Yellow for French translations of our games, for example. So whatever revenue we get from Yellow on a game that's translated in French, the exact amount that they give us, a set percentage would be what we would pay to the designer of that game as part of the contract. So that's a pretty standard way to do that. Same would be true of like software. So that's how we do our digital revenue. So we would take the revenue that we get, but we'd have to take out like what we pay to Google Play for Android and what we pay to Apple and stuff. So there's a bunch of money that comes out before we get the money. But then once we get a certain amount in our bank, then X percentage of that would be royalty payment to the game designer. That's another example. And then derivative works. So the word derivative works just legally means you're taking a particular intellectual property and you're kind of like branching it off. Like it's based on it and it's recognizable as being originating as part of something that's owned by someone or licensed by someone, but you're creating a variation of it called a derivative work. And in the board game industry, derivative works are typically expansions, but they could also be like, so for example, like there's lanterns I don't know how this game's licensed, but like there's Lanterns and there's like the Lanterns dice game. So like that would be considered like a derivative of, sort of that Lanterns universe and that Lanterns intellectual property. Just throwing that out as an example. There's tons of examples like that. I don't even know if I have no idea how their licensing agreement works, but as an example, that's another example of like, so there's expansions, but there might also be like a new game that's based off of the brand that was built by the original game. How we do derivative works, or how we've done derivative works, is this is something that I think is important if you are developing a game which might have expansions, is we have given first right of refusal to the designer. So if we're going to do an expansion, we would go to them and say, hey, would you like to design this expansion? We'd like to do an expansion, this what we want to do. And they have a set amount of time to decide whether or not they want to do it. And if they want to do it, they get a certain percentage of the revenue. And if they don't want to do it because they're really busy with something else or whatever, or they, for whatever reason, then we could design it, or we could hire another designer to design it, and they would get a lower percentage, but they'd still get a percentage because it's still based off of their original intellectual property. Because, and with expansions, like you're not going to buy the expansion unless you bought the original game. So, that's why it makes sense that they would also get a royalty off of that. Let's see. Oops. All right. So royalties, I think everyone knows what a royalty is, but, it's a commission paid to you for each game sold. So it's like a sales commission. When I sell one copy of your game, and how it's paid really varies. So I actually have a slide on this after I go through the legalese terms, but so there'll be a section in the contract which defines how royalties are calculated. And then there'll be a section which defines how they're paid out, like how frequently and how they're paid out. Like sometimes it will define how they're paid out, whether like bank wire transfer or whatever. Sometimes they don't get into that detail. And sometimes you need to like actually invoice the public. Seems a little backwards, okay, but this is going to sound backwards, but it's really, really important to know is in some contracts, many contracts actually, it'll say, okay, every quarter is the most common for royalty payments, we're going to send you a royalty report. And the royalty report is going to show you like how much we owe you. They say it in, much more complicated words, but basically what it says is once a quarter, we're going to tell you, here's how much we owe you. We sold this much your game. This is the amount we owe you. Then you will invoice us for that, and then we'll pay you. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is if you don't invoice them, you won't get paid. And because it's in the contract, they'll be like, well, we didn't get your invoice, so that's why we didn't pay you. So it's important to notice if that's in there, because if you get that email and you don't actually write back with an invoice, you'll be waiting and wondering like, hey, why didn't I get paid? And it's pretty easy to do an invoice. And it seems kind of silly, like I thought it was kind of silly, like when I first heard about this, like, why does that seem so backwards? Like, here's how much I'm going to pay you. Now you have to send me a bill and then I'll pay you. But the reason why is it's an accounting thing. So just accountants match invoices to payments, and it's a paper trail kind of thing. It's an accounting thing. So I guess just don't ask too much about it, but it's a pretty standard practice. If a company requires it, you usually cannot get around it. So I just want you to be careful that if it is in your contract, that you remember to actually send the invoices in a timely manner. Audit rights. So audit rights. I've heard someone complaining about audit rights recently. I can't remember who, but one of the publishers was saying someone was asking for ridiculous audit rights. So audit rights means, if you're like, oh, this doesn't seem right, like I see my game everywhere and everyone seems to be buying it and I see it all over the board game groups, but the publisher says they've only sold a small quantity, and you're kind of feeling like maybe they're not, like maybe the reports are not accurate. And for whatever reason, maybe it's you're worried that like you can't trust them. Maybe you're worried that they're doing the calculations wrong. So you can request, it's standard, and you should absolutely have in your contracts that you have the ability to audit their books. You most always should never use this. I think I was audited once, in hundreds of contracts that I had in my product lines. I was audited once, and it was because the company was being acquired. So when companies are being acquired, it's pretty common for them to have to audit all their finances. But generally people don't come in and audit. This is, again, if you have concerns or you're not sure, you feel like something's off, but it's protection that you want to have in there. And you want to just have that ability that if you're worried. Now, it's very standard that I'll say, give me 30 days notice and I'll give you my books. I'll give you the reports and you can review them. That's not because, oh, I'm being so sneaky and like I need to like fake my books or whatever. No. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the complaint that I saw on a Facebook group or on a Facebook post was that a publisher was saying that someone said, oh, they should be able to come in the same day and audit your books. And same day or next day and audit your books. It's because, like, what if I'm at Spiel and like, oh, that's when I also happen to take my one vacation a year to Amsterdam. So like I'm out of the country for 2 weeks and you're going to send me something saying, hey, Debbie, I need to like look at all your financial reports like tomorrow. What if I get back and my accountant happens to be on vacation? It's just the reality of life is like, I don't just have everything ready to go. We're all small businesses. We're all, well, maybe not all of us, but we all tend to be understaffed. So that's why the 30 days is in there, just so you know. So, and this comes back to like, someone was saying that like they've seen it in multiple contracts now. So you might want to, if you're providing the contract to someone, you might want to have someone look at the contract you're providing. If you're putting it together, make sure a couple people that know what they're doing have looked at it, because you don't want to be putting something crazy like that. Like no one should be demanding that they can look at someone's books like the next day or the same day. So, I don't think most of you would do that, but I'm just mentioning it as an example because people want to know examples of, what's stupid. So advanced royalty, this is really common. I don't know if you guys have seen this in your agreements, and it's like, hey, it's kind of in my opinion, like a sign of good faith. Like we believe we're going to make money on your game. We're going to give you an advance payment. I mean, I think these generally tend to be in the, I guess they could be anywhere in the hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars range, depending. This comes back to how much do they think they're going to make on your game and, how important it is to the designer. Like if it was really important to a designer to have more money up front because maybe, like I mentioned earlier, you have a medical bill you need to pay or, you need a few $1,000s. If you feel confident that your game's going to make a lot of money, then you might be able to negotiate that into your contract. Like if you say, this is really important to me, like I really, or you could also say, hey, when the Kickstarter for my game ends, is there any possibility I could get, my royalty payout, like when that money comes into your account? Within 30 days of that, instead of waiting till it's like technically a sale financially, because there's different ways you can do the royalty payments as well. But again, so thinking about like what's important to you. And it might be that they're like, no, sorry, we can't do that. That's not how we do it. Because honestly, usually with Kickstarters, it's complicated. Companies don't recognize that as revenue till the product actually ships. But many companies could do that. So, because they're small businesses, so, they can make it work. So, again, you should ask for things if it's important to you. I think advanced royalty payments are pretty common, but they tend to be small from what I've heard. So I don't think people should be expecting to get like $5,000 or $10,000, but you could, try to get like, 500 to a couple thousand, depending on what kind of game you have and what publisher you're talking to. If you've never been published and you're very eager to get published, I wouldn't ask for it if it wasn't offered. And I'd be happy to chat with anyone about like their personal situation and make recommendations on things that you might ask for or not ask for. But again, if it was like a personal situation where, like for me right now, I have 2 kids going into college in the fall. So if I was a game designer, I would love to get some upfront money. Because I am going to need a lot of cash flow next year because I have 2 kids going into college. So everyone has their own personal situations. Other people don't have a lot of expenses, So let's see, design and development work. So this can vary all over the map from what I've seen. So some people will just take a game and be like, thank you, we got it, we'll go from here. Other people, it depends on the style. We personally like to, work with the designers and get their input, and we'll often, I'm trying to think, at least in a couple of agreements I pulled up to look at before I did this presentation, we, had a certain amount of input and work we wanted them to do as part of the deal to get the game to a certain point. So you might be asked to do some work. Sometimes the work's paid for, sometimes it's part of the deal and you get it's part of the deal, but you get, royalty things. So if you're not happy with your royalty percentage, you could try to get, some payment for some additional work, and actually do some work on the game and the development of the game, or, start working on some expansions and work into it that you're going to get paid to work on expansions, and get a lower percentage. So I'm just throwing out ideas here for like different options that, the contracts vary a lot. So okay, I'm getting tired. Okay, designer representation. So this is like basically like you need to commit into the contract that you own this stuff and you have the right to give it away. So something that's important to keep in mind when you're designing your game, especially if you're buying art for it, is you need to make sure that you have the right art agreements so that you fully own everything that's in your game. So so for example, like if you have a situation where like you're using art from an artist, but they've also licensed it to other people to use for other things, a lot of publishers aren't going to want that. So you should try to get exclusive rights to the art, in my opinion. That's something that's important to us. Maybe it's not important to every publisher, but if the art is a big part of your game. I mean, sometimes publishers will totally replace the art, but what the designer representation part means is that you own the stuff, like you have all the agreements in place. So one of the things we do when we acquire a game is we audit the agreements. So we'll say, hey, we need to see all the agreements that you signed with your artists to make sure that, they've signed off their rights in the way that we need them to be signed off. I'm just explaining this so you guys aren't surprised if people ask you for this, and so that you've thought about it, and that if you're getting art and it's a key part of your game, make sure that you have a solid agreement for artists. And I can give you help on that if you don't know what I'm talking about. And then the publisher, you want to make sure the publisher, a couple things. One, that they have the authority to enter into the agreement, but also that they can perform the obligation. So, if they're saying, yes, I will run a Kickstarter within 2 years for this game, and they sign this and it has this publisher representation, they're legally agreeing to do that, which is good for you. Promotion and release. I personally really like to have something in my agreements about marketing. If I were a designer, I would want a lot more. I'd probably be a pain in the butt designer if I was working on a contract, because like I'd want to have as much detail as I could have in terms of, is the Kickstarter going to be run and when, and maybe not in the contract itself, but have some written exchanges on like what they're going to do to promote the game, because like that to me, I mean, I kind of think big and I want everything to be big and awesome. So I would want to like have conversations and know that like they were super excited and that they had marketing plans for my game. So, if it's not in writing, then you don't know if it's going to happen, because things change with companies. Confidentiality agreement. So this is standard in all contracts that, hey, I'm going to keep your stuff confidential. You keep my stuff confidential. But what exactly does that mean? And what that means is, and I've done a lot of work on this, so I kind of have a pretty good idea of the definition, is it should be marked confidential. If they give you a document and it's confidential, it should be marked as confidential. And if or they should verbally tell you if something's confidential. If you're like chit-chatting with someone and they're just talking about stuff, best practices is if it's confidential and they don't want you to share it, they should say, hey, I don't want you to share this information. It's confidential. I'll tell you, whether or not they say it or it's written on it, if they're talking about unreleased products, partnerships with other partners, terms of contracts with other partners or designers, I personally would consider any of those conversations confidential, and I wouldn't share them outside, because not everyone really thinks to say this is confidential information. Because I come from high tech, I'm always like, this is confidential, don't tell anyone. But a lot of people in our industry don't really think about it, but they generally don't want people talking about their business. Let's see. Okay, indemnity is really important. So I don't know if I spelled that right, but it's basically indemnification. So I noticed in our contract, one of our contracts, which came from the designer, it indemnified us, but it didn't indemnify them. So it said, hey, if something that we told you wasn't true, like say a piece of art actually was, ripped off from someone and you don't actually own it, because we find out later that like, oh, the artist that we bought it from, who signed this agreement, actually stole it, you know, copied it off of someone else, so we didn't actually own it, we screwed up. That protects the publisher from that error. Indemnification means, you know, if you screwed up, you're going to protect the other person from that problem. So depending on your situation and your financial situation, you should be careful about, you know, you should read those and understand what those mean. And you might, I know in the maple syrup one, they ask on their checklist if you've indemnified yourself. So I'm saying that in contracts I've seen, it indemnifies the publisher. I think it is a little bit hard. I think that generally the publisher is the one that's going to get sued, not the designer, if there's some kind of problem. So to me, it does make more sense to indemnify the publisher and not the designer. But, you know, apparently since it's on this checklist, I'm guessing that some designers have indemnified themselves. And then limited liability, I think, is very reasonable. So maybe you don't have indemnification on yourself, but you have limited liability, which means, hey, if something goes wrong, I will pay you up to like the amount you've paid me, but nothing more. Is kind of a common limited liability. Like, oh, if something like that happened and the publisher has to pay out some money, I'd be willing to pay out as much as, you know, they've paid me for the game, but like I'm not going to like, you know, have to like give up my house and stuff. So you kind of put a cap on what you will owe if things go wrong. I know this is probably a lot. We're to the end of the legalese, so I know this is a lot of information. So whoever's still on, you have a lot of patience and you really want to know this stuff. So revenue calculation, a few things on this. So there's a few different ways that you can do revenue calculation. And we've done both. We were doing net revenues, but now we've switched to wholesale revenue. And the reason why is it's just much easier to calculate after talking to other people and getting feedback. I feel like, I mean, we would still be willing to do a net revenue, but the reason why we moved towards a wholesale revenue in our most recent contract is because it's easier to calculate. So basically you look at the total volume sold, you take the wholesale price, which is a percentage of MSRP, and that's how much you owe. So whether you sold a copy on Kickstarter and got, you know, full price for it, in theory, full price for it, or whether you sold through distribution, the designer gets the same amount. So typically the percentage will be higher in this kind of a deal because it's a percentage of a lower percentage of the money that you bring in. But it's just simpler to calculate. So it's hard to explain, but it gets very complicated on the back end. Once you have multiple product lines and multiple games from designers and you have your partners to like just keep track of all of this. So doing the wholesale revenue, if someone has that, I wouldn't be surprised. And it's really just makes it easier for them to calculate, but the percentage is generally higher if it's of wholesale revenue. I can't really give you a number because honestly, I know people will probably like, oh, what should the percentage be? Again, it's going to vary depending on like the designer and how experienced they are and the publisher and how much money they think they can make from it and stuff like there's no like single answer for how much you should make. Work for hire, I'll mention. So in this checklist that Maple Syrup put together, they said avoid work for hire. So, and avoid net profits. I agree with avoid net profits. Net profits are just difficult to calculate. So I just think it's like net revenue is hard to calculate. Net revenue is the money you bring in minus like the very specific transaction cost. So like if I sell on my Shopify store, like Shopify is going to take money out and, you know, PayPal, the credit card is going to take money out. And then it's kind of like I was talking about earlier, whatever amount of money I put in my bank account for that, that's my net revenue, but it's not going to take into account like my salary percentage on that product line, for example. Like I work on all the product lines, so that's kind of hard to calculate. Net profits would take all our expenses as a company into account, and that's why it's hard to calculate. And it's easy to pad that. It's easy to put extra expenses in, and you could basically always not be profitable if you really wanted to be, so it's a tricky one. Work for hire, I don't think is a terrible one. They said avoid it. So I would avoid work for hire if you've designed a game and someone wants to do work for hire. But I think, you know, if you're a game designer and you're a passionate game designer, a work for hire agreement to do like a game on spec. So say like, you know, I wanted to do a new Star Realms game and it was going to be like a very specific type of game. And, you know, we were strapped and we needed someone to do it. I might hire someone as a contract worker, as a work for hire to design that game. And like, I've definitely seen lots of people do work for spec, and you can do some really cool, exciting games that way. And yeah, I mean, if you're like a famous designer, maybe you could work a deal where you get a percentage of the revenue. But, if you're like gonna create something which is based on a very established game system, and you're kind of, doing some pretty basic, design and development work, I think a work for hire could be, a fine, fantastic arrangement for you to help you bring in income while you're designing your own games on the side and, not yet making any money. So again, like, you don't want to, like, you see this and you say, oh, don't ever do work for hire. I'm just saying, like, hey, yeah, there's some situations where work for hire might make sense, like, also a lot of people will do like development work as work for hire. So, work for hire, what it means is, generally what it means is, it's typical in a contract worker contract is, I'm going to pay you this much either for the project or by the hour. And that's what you're getting. I'm getting the work. I own everything. I own all the intellectual property. I own everything you did. And you're getting this set amount. The good news is, you're going to get that set amount. Even if I never sell one copy of that game, you're getting paid this amount. So there's like a lot of attractive things about work for hire. The negative is, you're not going to get a royalty. So if this game's like a super duper hit and like you developed it, but you're a work for hire, you're going to get that whatever I paid you by the hour, and that's it. And I'm just throwing this out as an example. We don't actually usually hire developers. We do most of our development in-house, but yeah, just saying that as an example for work for hire, so you kind of know what that means. But if it's your own game, yeah, designing as a contract worker doesn't make sense in my mind. So I agree with the licensing your game checklist for that. Scaling royalty with volume. So that is a common thing. I didn't initially, I hadn't really thought about it, but when someone asked for it, it made a whole lot of sense that basically the scale, it's basically like, what if my game's a super duper hit? Like, what if my game's like the next Wingspan? And this was my first design. I had no idea. And I negotiated this contract. I took whatever they gave me, and then it's a super hit. Oh my goodness. If you put a scaling royalty rate in there, then and we've definitely done this where if it goes above a certain amount, then the percentage goes up. And if it goes above another amount, the percentage goes up. So totally reasonable to ask for it. Possibly, I don't know. Some publishers might be turned off by that. I think it's totally reasonable. Okay, let's see. PM gave a comment here. I worked on a game for a year for a publisher who only spoke with my co-designer, and there wasn't a contract in place. The game didn't end up getting published. I didn't get paid anything for my work. Looking back, I should have made sure there was a contract to get paid for my time. Yes. So, yeah, I want to make a comment on that. So this happens. This is not that uncommon thing to happen where people do a lot of work. And sometimes you do a lot of work and the thing does get published and you don't get paid and you don't get any money. So it is really important to have paperwork in place whenever you're putting a significant amount of time into a project, and don't be afraid to ask for something. So say you're working with a friend and you're developing their game with them, but the game's not yet published. You can work out a deal and put something on paper that hey, we're going to partner on this, and or maybe you're going to each do work on each other's projects X number of hours per week, or, we're going to partner, 70-30 because you're going to do more of it and I'm going to do less of it. But right now we're not going to get any money because we're not making anything. This is if and when we ever make a deal. So I've done contract work before where I was working for a startup. So I love working for startups. The startup didn't have any money, and I worked for them by the hour for a very low hourly rate, way lower than what my going rate would have been. But we worked into it that if they got funding as a company, that I would get paid X amount per hour. And they did eventually get funding, and, I got paid that amount. You can also, if you're working for a company like that, like a startup company, ask for ownership. So I know a lot of people work for publishers, and and they're not owners. I mean, I think probably the most common model is there's a couple of owners, and then most of the other employees are not owners. So if you're in that situation but you feel like you are doing a lot of work and you're creating a lot of the core revenue, that's again another negotiation situation. Maybe they want to retain ownership the way that it is, but you could ask for some profit sharing or a bonus based on Kickstarter performance. So you have to be creative. Sometimes it comes back to what's important to people and what they want. Some people, it's really, really important to them to have ownership in a company. Like I joined White Wizard Games, after it was founded, and I was not an owner of the company, but it was really important to me to be an owner of the company. Once I joined full time, and I was like putting my whole life into it, even though, Rob and I were planning to get married, it was really important to me. So I put together, my case of why I felt that, I should have ownership, what that might look like, and, went through a lot of iterations. But, in the end, I now am an owner of the company. So, which I was very excited about. But it's a huge thing, especially most companies are structured as LLCs. So it's a big thing to give people ownership. But you should absolutely be paid for time on a game, especially if you're working for a publisher, that might have money, So if you're working by the hour, I think that's why I'm saying work for hire could be a really good situation, especially if you need income to pay your bills and stuff. And you could do like I did, like work for hire, but if it does reach a certain point, then you'll get a percentage, but it all depends on your situation. Like definitely some people will work, either for free or for very low rates because they're trying to get experience in an industry or whatever. But, definitely try to, negotiate what the value is of what you're doing, because generally, if you're doing awesome work, you should be getting paid for it. The terms for worst case scenario, I think I already talked about that. Basically, what if your game doesn't sell, or what if the publisher never publishes your game? Like usually when you're signing a contract, it's like when you get married, like everything's all great and you're like in love and you're so excited your game's getting signed, but like it does happen that like people get busy or things come up or companies get bought and like your project just gets shelved. So you should try to get that worked into your agreement. So think about what is the worst case scenario. And this is also true when you think about like whether or not to sign a contract. What's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen with this contract? And that can be helpful. So like your deal where you worked on this, the worst thing that happened was you worked on it, didn't get published, and you didn't get paid anything for it. But I hope that it was a fantastic experience for you where you learned a lot at a minimum. But, that's one thing to think about in these contracts. What's the worst case? Because it does happen that people sign their games and it gets shelved. So, or they launch it and it bombs. So think about what that means. Sometimes people get their games back. I've heard of people getting their games back. I didn't know about that originally, but I heard about that. When someone told me, they got their game back because it didn't it didn't sell as much as they wanted it to. So I haven't personally experienced that, but that's the end of my presentation. So, and I've gone over an hour. So you guys have been very patient listening to all this legal stuff. So this is my contact information. If anyone wants to reach me, you can message me on Facebook too. So I'm pretty easy to get a hold of, but I'm also very, very busy. So, if you ping me and I don't write back right away, you can always ping me again. I'm definitely want to be there. I want to help people. So I do have a lot on my plate. I haven't really talked about my personal stuff, but my husband and I, between us, have 7 children, and we got 2 puppies during the pandemic, 2 COVID puppies. So we're busy, but I want to help. I love to help people. So, just ask me if you need help with something. So I hope this was helpful to everyone. And if you have questions, I'm not used to talking one way, so I feel like I'm giving a lecture, but I love to chat with people. If you have questions and you want to chat, you want to do a call at some point, we can do a one-on-one, because I think a lot of this stuff is very personal, because like I said, it depends on what you're personally trying to do. And but I definitely also want to help people that are trying to build their career in the industry and trying to find ways to build up their income in the industry, because that was my goal. I saw Rob and Darwin work in the industry and how much fun they were having, and I wanted to be here. So I work with them part-time to grow the company so I could come and join full-time. But I want to help other people because I think it's an awesome industry. So thank you. I'm gonna sign off now unless any last questions? No? Okay, great. Bye, guys.